Well, there are some tools that are, so we are here as planners and transportation consultants. What we can't do is give you some, well, there are some management tools we can give you, but the management of this population, there are some things the comprehensive plan can address, and there are some things that the comprehensive plan cannot address. So and you'll hear us talk about that as we move forward. It's not an easy answer, but we want to be very truthful about what we think the comprehensive plan can indeed help you with, and what is another department's responsibility. And certainly, so for example, how you decide to manage short-term rentals. We have some proposal, or a proposal for how that should be managed. You'll all decide if you want to promote that idea or not, right? So you could make it harder, or you could make it easier. That's not for us to determine, it's for you and the commission to determine how you deal with the tourism. But of course we know that it generates an enormous amount of revenue for this county. All right, so the different types. The environmental and natural ones are actually were easy to map. You've done so already, and your comprehensive plan already has a lot of good regulations or policies in place in terms of conservation and coastal management. We're trying to beef them up, and you'll hear our consultants talk about it. But essentially, the conservation and parks are all sort of taken care of. On the other hand, the corridor place types are going to be quite different. This slide illustrates the difference between an urban and a suburban condition. The urban one is one that has buildings along wide sidewalks, tree-lined sidewalks with parking hidden in the rear. There's an express desire to put the parking in the rear so that there's activity and vibrancy at the level of the street, and the way the buildings meet the street encourage that level of walkability and interaction between people. Now, you also have the suburban one, which is where buildings are set back, where there's parking in front. It's not particularly hospitable to bikers and pedestrians, but in a county as varied as yours, you need both. So you're going to continue having both. The issue is, where do you really want to encourage a better urban frontage? Where does it already exist? Where can we strengthen it? And that's where the urban corridors would be mapped. It's easy to map the rural and natural corridors too, because they'll remain this way for the foreseeable future. The rural going through the agricultural lands, and the natural, of course, going through your natural areas. And then you have very different community or settlement types. You already know the TNDs, that's the traditional neighborhood developments, that's the seaside, Rosemary Beach, for example, those communities that really aggregate a big mix of uses and really promote a rich public realm and a vibrant street life. And it's the zoning category that gives the most density, ironically. That tells us that when it's well done, density is not an issue. Too often people tend to associate high density with bad and low density with good. And as I'm sure you can see with projects around this county here, you can do both very well or very poorly. So the TND is the one that has the greatest mix of uses and the greatest, in some respects, intensity. The villages also have a mix of uses and some building types, residential building types, but they tend to be more separated. They have sidewalks. An example of that is what's happening at Origins, or a lot of what St. Joe is doing. But then they're not as compact as the TNDs. Hammock Bay is also an example of that, because they have this kind of housing here, that kind of housing here, this kind of housing there. But then there is commercial that some people can walk to. But it's a lot of pods of too much, as opposed to trying to mix it up a little. Some people like that and they want to live in that environment. Some people like the TNDs and want to live in that environment. And some people like the suburban, as you see here, and want to live in that. The issue is not to say we think you should be promoting one that is more sustainable, but it's fundamentally it's going to be for you all to decide and to convince the commissioners about what you want to see. The suburban types are more economically fragile, and they're harder to retrofit. It's harder to imagine how they can evolve to become a place. Sometimes they have sidewalks, sometimes they don't. Sometimes there's no privacy of a backyard. So we're hoping you end up approving less of those, but there's always going to be those who want it. And then there's the rural, which of course is going to remain. That's for people who love that rural lifestyle and want to preserve it. And those are the very large rural lots. Okay, so now how do we map this? We proposed, this is a complicated chart, I'm going to go through it because we proposed 4 options to the county moving forward. Of those 4, there's 2 we're not recommending, and I'll tell you why. And there's 2 that are possibilities, but there's one we're promoting over another because we think it's the one that's going to afford you the most flexibility. Thank you. We've explained this to the county staff, they've vetted it, and they think this is also the most logical way to move forward. So, option one is essentially business as usual. You just tweak your FLU a little bit, you tweak your zoning a little bit, but essentially you don't disrupt what you have, you just provide a few fixes. We think that will be the least satisfying option to you, except maybe for those developers who are used to working under the system and can get the rezonings done the way they want to do it. So they know how to take advantage of the system. It's not that necessarily it's a bad thing. Some are good, some are less good. But it's not what we're recommending because we think Walton County deserves more. On the other end of the spectrum is converting your entire FLU to place types. It's complex, it takes years. We spent years doing this for Orange County. It just got adopted last week. But it's very politically difficult to do, and it's very ambitious. So we think there are steps that you can take that are sort of intermediate or incremental steps, and if this works, you could eventually, years from now, decide to move to more of a place type designation for your FLU. Because by definition, your FLU is your future land use. And we've always found it very strange that land uses are assigned to a future way in which land can develop. When we think of all the beautiful places in the world, those uses have changed in the buildings over time. So we like to think of the character of a place, and that's why we're promoting this idea of place types. So we're not recommending this one because it's the most ambitious. Now, for those of you who are here, it's hard to believe a year ago, we presented this in May when we did the visioning charrette. And what this one is essentially telling the county, let's be proactive and let's designate areas where we know place types should already be mapped by virtue of property owners we know have ideas, by virtue of areas that are already transitioning to some kind of development. And that could very well be done, but how do you handle future place types? What if a couple of property owners come together and want to do a place type that's not designated on the map? So we were thinking about that because, for example, at the visioning charrette, we ran through 3 different scenarios where the populations were essentially the same, but depending on where you assign place types, it would actually it would raise the population, it would rebalance the population. So, for example, if you had 3 urban centers, if you had an urban corridor that's a mile long versus 6 mile long, that has an implication in terms of development. So we think there are some areas that can automatically be mapped this way, but county staff, and we understood this, were also concerned about, well, what if someone wants to come to us and that hasn't been designated? How do we deal with this? So we came up with the 4th scenario, which is the one we're recommending, and that is to develop a sector map. Now, a sector map is an area that is a large designated area, and it determines where growth can occur. And it also determines the degree of growth that should take place. So we've suggested 3 types: preserve, maintain, and grow. It's exactly what the name implies. The preserve are those areas that are already pretty much either fully developed, or they are your agricultural and rural land that are not going to change in any significant manner. The maintain are a lot of the areas along 30A that have already developed and that may take some infill, but it's not going to radically change either. And then the grow is where the growth is occurring. And we have heard people say it's really moving north of the bay. So how do we shape that growth in a way that makes sense? And so our proposal is to say, you determine which place types are allowed within each sector. So it's not every place type everywhere, but it is promoting this idea of a certain intensity in those areas. Now, we've taken a stab at a very big picture, assigning the sectors. It's not our role to define where those should be, but we want to give the county the methodology by which they would get there. You're going to take a look at it. There'll be lots of sessions with county in terms of deciding, how it should be allocated, because we have had to reconcile it to not only the existing zoning, but also the existing place types. And so here's an example of a rough pass as how we've looked at it. And so, for example, you can see that the growth sectors are naturally around the incorporated areas of Defuniak and or Freeport. So we want to give you the criteria and the mechanism by which you allocate those place types, but there should be an ability to modify that and change it before this is, as you adopt the idea of a sector. We've presented this idea preliminarily to the Board of Commissioners. Some of you may have heard us. They seemed interested in the idea, and so we hope that this will move forward. Now, I'm going to show you examples of each. So let's start with the centers. I'm not going to go through every single one of them, but explain to you a little bit of how we organized it. Because if you've seen our report, we show the character of areas based on some renderings that you see here, so that people can get an understanding, and there's a common understanding of what a rural center may look like. So we describe it. We give its general characteristics. How many acres are needed to designate it? You know, what are the zoning categories that fit within it? And what's the range of zoning categories? Because we want to make it flexible enough within a certain parameter to ensure that you get more of one building type and less of another. You don't want it to be too urban, but you also, even the rural areas deserve a little kernel of commercial and a little kernel of maybe live works or townhouses around the plaza. And then the rest can be very large areas. So one thing we are doing is encouraging an idea of rural clustering as one of the options in exchange for sort of more permanent preservation of open space. And that means slightly extra density in those areas, possibly. That has worked very well in other parts of the country. We know that there was a proposal a few years ago to do a rural cluster, and somehow it failed. From what I understood from discussions with commissioners, because it wasn't particularly well explained. Maybe that's too simplistic, but it's something that we think should be considered. And then here's an example, for example, of the urban center. This is the most urban you would get. And you see the characteristics on the right. You see the building types that are encouraged. So you'd have more multifamily, you have more attached types than maybe detached types, whereas the rural is many more detached and then maybe very, very few attached types. And of course, the idea of an urban center is it really does encourage that walkability. The buildings behave vis-a-vis the street. And for this to be triggered, it would require that property owners assemble a minimum of 20 acres. So somebody who has, let's say, 15 acres would not be able to come to the county and say, we want an urban center. They'd have to find their neighbors and get in together with the neighbors and come forward with a proposal that tends to make sense. We've seen this strategy work really, really well around the country, where property owners come together, proactively work with the county. In fact, the county where I live, Montgomery County in Maryland, it's exactly what happened. There was a mall, it was dying, and the 6 or 7 property owners that owned the land around it went to the county and said, we want to see how, we want this place to evolve. And the county said, fine, we'll work with you, but we're going to develop the map. And so in collaboration with the community and with the developers, they decided where the open space would be, they decided where new streets would go, they decided where density heights should go, and it really was they've moved forward to the first phase, they're well into the second phase. It's been very successful, and it's a really good example of a public-private partnership where the community had a say, the planning department really took an active role, and the developers were happy because there was a level of predictability that was established for them, and they were able to build what the community had agreed that they wanted early on. Now, the corridors. This is the urban corridor, again, is the most urban type. There are already places that are naturally that. And so, you know, you want to be able to encourage those at specific nodes at the intersection of important streets, up and down 331, where we know that's an economic development corridor that's already been identified as such. Other places can become suburban corridors and can be what they are. What you don't want to see is, you know, a building that is up against the street, up against a sidewalk with a wide sidewalk, and then it's surrounded by, you know, buildings that are set back with parking in front. It doesn't give that business a chance to succeed or evolve into another place. So you want to think of urban corridors at the level of either 1 or 2 blocks minimum. And those could be mapped immediately. We've actually talked to the county about where those would make sense to be mapped. And of course, you will continue to have suburban corridors. You have a lot of them. They can retrofit, but even along your suburban corridors, there are ways to improve it. You could decide where you want to only have 1 bay of parking versus many, many bays of parking. You could decide that you want to encourage shared drives between property owners so that they can, you don't have too many curb cuts that interrupt the sidewalk. There are ways even to make those environments a little better. And FDOT is one of those state departments of transportation that's actually quite evolved when they think about the street types. They've identified the need for a context-sensitive development or streets, and that, basically what that says is the design of the street should be commensurate with the development that happens on either side. So for example, what they draw here is they say when you're going through a rural area, you have swales, you don't have curbs, you have very few access points. As you start to go towards the more urban areas, you have many more curb cuts, it's curb, you have a curb and gutter, and many more streets that intersect with that. Every one of those characters exists here. They even have a suburban one. So it's going to be very important for the county to work with FDOT on those county and those state streets to ensure that when you do designate an urban corridor, it gets that urban designation so that the street can very much reinforce the character that exists on either side of it. And then there are the settlement types, of course, or the community types. This is the rural settlement. You already have rural settlements. We're simply proposing allowing for rural clustering as an option to preserve more open space in perpetuity in exchange for a slightly higher density at its center. Not too much more, but just maybe, as I mentioned before, for a corner store or a few live works. And as you can see here, it's hard to see, but the green bar you see at the bottom, that's indicating a vast majority of those will be detached rural housing. But then you would have single-family attached. You may have very few attached building type, but they're still at the center. That does exist. Because even if you live in a rural area, still would be nice for your child to be able to, you know, walk to the corner store and get some milk or sugar or whatever it need be. Not everybody can do that, but you shouldn't also have to drive for miles and miles before you get to a little corner store. And the counties recognize this because there is that general commercial that the zoning has been laid over those, the rural centers at those intersections all around the county. Except the problem is the development capacity there is exactly the same as it is on the south, and it really shouldn't be. In rural areas, you should have less capacity than you do in the more urban areas. And then here's an example of a village settlement. They can be very nice for those who don't want the frenetic energy of, you know, living next to people who live in a townhouse or in a multifamily building, or who want a slightly bigger yard. You know, I live in a TND, designed by DPZ, Mike does too. We've deliberately said we're happy to live in a smaller unit with a smaller yard in exchange for the entire community that is a playground for our kids. And it really does work that way. You know, our kids have both learned to ride bikes and scoot and skate and do whatever they want. Free range kids to go to the town center. Some people want that. Not everybody, but many people do. And so we have to find a way to facilitate this and make it as easy to build the kinds of places that we like, or that some people like, and not only have the suburban type, which is the easiest one to permit. The reason that gets done more often than not is because it's the easiest one to get through. It's much harder to design more complex communities. So it's all about leveling the playing field. And then there's the suburban settlements. You'll continue to have these, and even if you have those, we still think that once you get over a certain acreage, the county should be requiring a mix of building types. We asked them to send us, when we began this project, all the projects that were being reviewed, and there were some that were way too large to have one building type. We were seeing entire communities being designed with essentially one lot type, and that's just economically fragile, as you've heard us say before. So over a certain size, even if it remains suburban, it still should have a little mix of uses, so that we're not all living next to people who look exactly like us. Some people want that. There's already plenty of that around. And then the TND, you all know it well. Here it is, it's the most robust. It would only be permitted in the maintain and the grow sector. It wouldn't be permitted, obviously, in the preserve sector. And the sector is really what's going to determine how rezonings happen, because there's too many property owners who come forward with a rezoning application, and there's no rhyme or reason as to why they're asking for one designation over another. So that sector map gives a certain level of predictability to you as community members, as well as the Board of County Commissioners, to at least begin to say, you know what, this place type is appropriate here, or no, it's not appropriate here. We're not going to redefine the sector map just for one project. When we evolve the sector map 2 years from now, 5 years from now, however often they choose to evolve it, we may accept more intense building types. But up until then, there's only a limited number that gets permitted in the maintain, and it's obviously in the growth sector that you allow for the more robust types. And this is an example of a comparison of the different settlement types that shows the different mix and range of residential types within each. So as you can see in the rural one, the green bar, that's the majority of rural. There's very little attached type. And when you go to the TOD, or the transit-oriented development, which is where there may eventually be a future transit stop along Highway 20, I think, reserve that land for potentially a future TOD, because that could be a really wonderful place. And that would have much more attached building types and, of course, fewer single-family homes. So, how do we evolve this, or give this to you in a manner that's logical? So here's our conversion chart, and it looks complicated, but it shows the existing FLU categories. It shows what are the permitted place types in each, and then all the zoning categories that already exist in your land development code that are permitted in each place type. And then each place type is pegged to the growth sector. I know this sounds very technical, but we spent a lot of time looking at all the different FLU categories, reading the intent of the FLU, trying to make sure that the buildings, too often your comprehensive plan is trying to encourage certain building types in some of the FLU categories, but the land development code doesn't allow it. Either the density is too low, or there's setbacks are too much or too blunt, and you're not getting that type of development. Yes? But this is available on as a PDF that you can download. Yes, the county has those. Yes, and they can make them available to you. As I said, you are all going to work through how these sectors get mapped, keeping in mind that it has to somehow align with what the underlying zoning is. We're not showing this to you so that you can't read it. On the contrary, we want you to have it. So a few people have emailed me asking me, can we get a large-scale map? And I've just asked them to contact the county so that they can get those maps. Yes? I'm sorry? Okay, well then we will make sure that that map, we'll give it to Stephen, and that you can get it, and have it at whatever scale you want, so that you can really zoom into it. Because as you can see from this drawing here, we have taken a stab at identifying a little bit where that should go. You guys will continue tweaking it. Certain areas like Chat Holly really needs to be looked at very, very specifically, because that's one area that is evolving and growing very quickly. We're hoping that there's a way to rationalize the growth a little more. But the 5.7 and the 2.4 you see here is just essentially us saying, we know people are afraid of change and they're afraid of growth. But even if we go to the high end of the population that's anticipated to come here, the 5.7 is essentially saying, if you continue encouraging more single-family homes and not too much of the attached building types, so 80% are done in single-family homes and 20% are done in all the other types, you would only be occupying an additional, or developing an additional 5.7% of the entire county land. If you flip that around and say, no, we're going to actively encourage smaller unit types, which we know our demographics are trending this way, it helps with the affordability crisis, there are already enough single-family homes. Now, developers are going to provide what the market wants, but most cities know they need more of the smaller unit types, so that the affordable housing is not only provided in massive multifamily buildings. So if you were to do 80% everything but single family and 15 or 20% single family, you'd only be occupying 2.4% of the land. So it's okay, it's not that bad. It's not as if your county is going to redevelop in the next 20 years in ways that are going to be completely unrecognizable for all of you who live here. And then I'm going to end on these, which are, so when you look at our report, now you won't see, we haven't, the draft that's on the county website or our website does not indicate what should be a new policy or what is a recommendation. We've now updated it. We were waiting till today's session, and once we talk to the county commissioners to see if there's any other recommendations we should be including, or if there are some recommendations that there just isn't the political will to promote or move forward at this stage. But you're going to see the recommendations like this are going to be new policies, and then there are going to be recommendations. So for example, and this is a controversial one, to preserve neighborhood character, consider reducing the height of single-family homes from 50 feet to 40 feet or 3.5 stories in the neighborhoods with preservation plans, maybe to start off with. And then if it's successful, begin to adopt it around the county. Some people think that's a great idea, some people are afraid of it. I'll tell you frankly, I've never worked in a county that allows 50 feet for a single family home. We find that, crazy. And we've heard too many people tell us it's ruining the character of our neighborhoods. So you're going to have property owners objecting to this a lot, and you're going to have some who are going to love it. You will all have to duke it out with the commission and see what they choose to adopt. But that's why we've put it in as a recommendation and not as a policy, because we know it's going to be super controversial. The other one we've talked about with Mark, who's advising us from a legal standpoint, is can you reclassify single-family homes with 5 or more bedrooms or 6 or more bedrooms, whatever that trigger is, that are used at short-term rentals for more than a certain amount of time as commercial buildings, because that is fundamentally how they're operating. That's a policy decision that the commissioners will choose to, they'll say yes or no, and it'll have to be debated. Same thing with your flu. Now in your flu, we've got a lot of recommendations. Everything from recommending a TDR program, which is a transfer of development rights, which is essentially saying there are areas that you really shouldn't be developing in. There are areas that are surrounded by floodplains, or in the floodplain, let's say, but there's still development that's allowed on there. It's very hard for property owners to develop those areas. So what about transferring the density that's allowed? That property owner gets paid to transfer the density to areas where we want to encourage development, for example, along corridors. And so it's a complex system, but it's a very good way to manage growth, and to, especially in areas that have a lot of sensitive natural areas, to ensure that those areas that are, you provide incentives. Those areas that are in the floodplain, you tell developers, if you provide it in the upland, we may give you additional capacity, or we may allow you to transfer those development rights somewhere else. So we have about 7 different policies we're recommending, and then some other, so policies, yeah, we're recommending, and then just some general recommendations. So for example, we've noticed that some of the flu categories are practically identical. They don't generate very different forms, so we're recommending consolidating them. That's technical, but it's necessary. We're also recommending the adoption of a form-based code for those people who choose to avail themselves of place types. So what is a form-based code is a discussion in and of itself, but it essentially says the form of buildings are more important than the land use that's within it. And what it really requires that setbacks be managed vis-a-vis the street and vis-a-vis the space between the buildings in a way that really creates a more predictable outcome, so that we understand where certain buildings have an intensity or an urbanity that should be encouraged versus not. So while your land development code needs a lot of work, that's a whole project in and of itself. You could begin small by saying, in exchange for those property owners who are going to come to us with the desire to develop these place types, which are by nature more complicated, as opposed to each of them writing their own design standards or their own PUDs, and then there's many different types of design guidelines that the county has to administer. Instead, let's agree as to what those standards should be. We know how a single family home should sit on a lot generally, what the general setback should be, and there's a range within it. We know that when you're developing townhouses, you don't want them to be front-loaded. They should be rear-loaded, because if you front-load them, the entire front yard is taken up with a garage. So that's what we mean when we talk about a form standard. When you're developing multifamily buildings, you really don't want the building to be surrounded by parking. You want people to have an address on a street, and you want the multifamily to be anchored to a downtown or to a commercial corridor, so that those who choose to live in a multifamily building are choosing to live so deliberately because they can walk to many more activities and uses that are in and around them. So a form-based code would allow you to do that, because it also regulates the design of the streets and where open space should be provided, in addition to the uses that are allowed. So, for example, your code may say provide 5% open space, on a property. It doesn't tell you how that open space should be provided, if it should be dribbled in the back of people's homes and not amount to anything. A form-based code defines what is a plaza, what is a green, what is a square, what is a community garden, and provides standards for those. So it just makes it easier. What's a playground? And it's the same thing. So it's not that hard to do, and especially to adopt it as an overlay, so that it's not forced onto people, but it's for the county to decide if we do want to promote this idea of a form-based code. of these place types, it would be nice to have a form-based code attached to it. You know, everywhere we go, we hear developers tell us, we're tired of going in front of Board of Commissioners or city councils and having the community come up and object to everything we're doing. Just give us a higher burden in terms of the great urbanism you want us to create. And if we meet that burden, we should be allowed to we should proceed by right. It should not be this convoluted, torturous process for everybody, which is really depressing. And then there's few recommendations for recreation, and in particular, it has to do with where open space should be provided. Because while you have a lot of open space in the form of conservation lands and state forests, there are not a lot of parks that are within a certain walking distance of a lot of the homes. So Max from GridX has been helping the county and us really draw up a map that identifies where is there a need for those parks and playgrounds that are where you can more actively use those spaces for sports or for picnicking. You know, it's great to have the wonderful trails you have, but you also need just parks where people can go throw a frisbee or kick a soccer ball. So that's one of those recommendations. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to either Scott or Chris to come and walk you through the transportation.
Good afternoon. My name's Chris Phillips. I work for Jacobs. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to come and talk about the transportation element of the comprehensive plan review. Let's see if I can press the right button. Hey, there we go. So the entire review was looking at how to make Walton County not only a better place to live, but how do we make that a better place to live as far as transportation goes. And some of the recommendations and policies that we're going to discuss will be aimed at traffic safety. It's up to you as the citizens to encourage your government to put safety first. We're also going to talk about active transportation and how that can help reduce vehicles on the road. Also going to get into traffic performance metrics and identify some key transportation corridors. You know, considering transit and alternative transportation, again, helps get that traffic off the road. So if you want to just, you know, go from neighborhood to neighborhood and you're close by, perhaps you can have an opportunity to hop on a bicycle or a golf cart if the road is appropriate for such a thing. And then finally, mobility hubs. A mobility hub is a place where it's kind of a central place where it's more than just a bus stop, but it's a place where you can come and you can ride your bike and perhaps catch a transit means if you have one there, or you know, maybe you want to leave your bike there and walk to your next destination. So we'll get into those as we go along. So the first policy we're going to talk about talks about safety, and it is a Vision Zero action plan. So FDOT has a Target Zero policy, and the nexus behind that is we want to eliminate all fatalities in the state of Florida that are related to transportation. And fatalities and crashes in this area have increased over the last 10 years. And so there are many safety measures that you can put into place in order to increase safety. At your intersections, you can include lighting. Lighting is a pedestrian's best friend, especially at night, obviously. Or along some corridors where you have a lot of pedestrians, you light those areas up, and they don't have to be, you know, the really bright, obnoxious LED bright lights. They could be a more dimmer light now that we have the great LED technology. Pavement markings, that's, you know, that can include high emphasis crosswalks. It's the crosswalk that's not just the two parallel lines any longer, but it's the dashes that you see, and those really stand out for the motorist to see that, hey, this is where people are going to be walking. Your comprehensive plan can reference the DOT guidance from Target Zero by reference, or the county can develop their own, and that's something that can be done as the comprehensive plan amendment changes go forward. But one key factor of that is to not set goals that you can't achieve. It's best to start small and identify some small locations where you can make a really quick impact with this lighting and these pavement markings as you go forward. Also, another policy is to develop a complete streets plan. And complete streets, DOT has really came on board with complete streets when it comes for them to add lanes for capacity improvements. I know in Santa Rosa County, they're 6-laning US 98, and they're adding a multi-use path next to that that looks like an additional lane, but it's separated for safety. And that complete streets not only adds capacity, but it adds trees, and it adds things like benches and perhaps on-street parking, depending on the type of road. And you get into the, again, as previously discussed, that context classification. So that means that perhaps in the more urban areas, you're going to narrow that lane down from 12 feet down to maybe 10 or maybe even 9 feet to slow people down if you have a lot of walkability advantages in that area. And as you go forward, you identify these corridors based on that context classification to be able to focus on those anytime you have street improvements, or if you put that plan together and you do an analysis for that specific street, you can then seek grants based on the plan that you have put together. This policy is to develop on-grade separations. An on-grade separation is essentially pedestrian overpasses or perhaps tunnels, depending on the location. You do need a lot of land to be able to do that. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Daytona, but the overpass near the racetrack, you have to have ADA compliance, so the landing gets really large. So there are some constraints there as far as the right-of-way. But you identify these areas with high speeds, because you have to, it's always, in transportation, it's always a delicate balance between the pedestrian and the car. So you're looking for a place where you want to keep the traffic moving, but you need to be able to get the pedestrians moving. And then finally, you start looking at a safety assessment where you're thinking you're going to put those. And these take into account, again, pedestrian counts, traffic counts, and there are many different technologies now to be able to count that. It's not the old tubes across the road anymore that count the traffic. You can count traffic because most people have a cell phone and they have their Bluetooth turned on, so you can put sensors out there to tell just how many cars go back and forth. So these are the ways to be able to look at where these places would be appropriate for these pedestrian overpasses or tunnels. And then finally, it's appropriate to put together an active transportation master plan for your bike ped community. If you make it easier for people to ride their bicycles and walk, then they're likely to do that, especially during the springtime and during the fall when it's not so hot, because we all know it's hot. It's hot now. So that would promote that definitely during the spring and the fall. And once you get that active plan together, again, step one of seeking any kind of grant is to put together a plan so that you have a roadmap literally of where you're going to go. And these trails, once they're built, they can definitely increase ecotourism. It increases and helps the overall health of the county because people can be out and exercise. Another policy is constrained facility policy. So this particular policy, it's best to have it outside the comprehensive plan. You can reference it in the comprehensive plan, but if you have it outside, it's easy to amend those streets and routes that are on there. So you see County Road 30A and Scenic Gulf Drive. Those are prime examples of places where you want to be able to get them on this list so that it's, I don't want to say harder, but it's harder to add lanes to those roads. And they're constrained anyway because of the character and the fact that the buildings are somewhat closer to them, and you have those bike ped features along those. But it's a good way to preserve the character of those areas such as these that you see here on the list. a comprehensive parking policy and plan. So everybody knows that parking is always a premium, especially during the summer months in areas that we have, especially in South County. So setting up these parking plans along the beach accesses and even some places north of the bay. And the technology can be used there to be able to show just how long it takes to get to these from certain places. So there's, for example, one technology is called a Blue Toad, and it is a sensor that it picks up the Bluetooth on your phone, and when you go or someone goes to the next sensor, it can tell how long it took you to get there. And these type things can be put on websites so that you'll know, honestly, whether you want to go to the beach that day or you want to go down this certain corridor that day, and maybe know when the better time to go. So all of these things can be put into your comprehensive plan to provide, again, a way forward to be able to realize the advantages that these technologies can provide you once you're able to implement them. And finally here, we're talking about comprehensive transit. You know, transit is always interesting in this part of Florida. You know, the joke is we run buses that we don't have anybody in. And so you have to be able to do pilot programs for these type of transit systems. And you know, back in the day, everyone wanted to do, you know, full-scale large buses. But there's something called microtransit now, which is a much smaller vehicle that a transit authority or a transit provider can provide, and it's more fuel efficient, and you're not, you know, moving a bus that could seat 50 people. You're moving a van, perhaps, that can seat 10, depending on what your ridership is. And here on this map, hopefully you can see that there are two areas that were proposed, not connected at this time, but again, pilot programs. See what kind of transit you can put together, and if it's worthwhile and your ridership is appropriate. And here we have a standalone low-speed vehicle policy. Low-speed vehicles have a top speed between 20 and 25. Typically, those are going to be your golf cart community. I know here in Walton County, you have your law enforcement has been very proactive in being able to regulate and enforce, you know, where these things are. I've seen some signs up, you know, giving very specific guidance on where they need to be. But it's very important to be able to give these folks a place to get out of the way so that you don't have, you know, 20 cars in a line following one of them, so that they can move and everyone can go by. And it's important to have a place if you're going to allow that, and evidently that's going to be allowed around here. But if you have that, you need to have a very specific place for them to go, because the last thing you want to do is put them on your multi-use trails where you have moms with strollers and children on training wheels learning to ride a bike, and then here comes a golf cart. So it's very important to be able to set these areas apart to be able to have appropriate places for them to go. And then here we have a policy on standardizing the beachside corridor planning consistency. And, you know, you have a very great amenity here, the beaches. And it's very important to be able to have the planning be somewhat consistent, but not so rigid, I think, that you lose the identity, because some of the beach neighborhoods are different than others. So it's good to be able to provide an appropriate branding with signage, and you know, so that people kind of know what to expect in these areas. I mean, it's good to have consistency as far as your multi-use trails go, but perhaps one size does not fit all. So these are ideas that you can go through the comp plan amendments to be able to you know, tailor these planning elements on where you live and provide input to the county. And so here we have intelligent transportation systems for parking. Technology has come so far in being able to identify in a parking lot how many parking spaces you have available. And it can be displayed on a message board as you approach that parking area. It can be displayed on an app that you have on your phone. Again, you can integrate the parking availability into the blue toad that we talked about, so you'll know, is it really worth going 12 minutes when it should only take 5 to a full parking lot? So these things, help people plan their routes better and to know when to patronize, these parking lots as you go forward. So some recommendations out of the review. Again, the safety analysis with all development reviews as they come into the county, and those can include crash analysis, and DOT has policy on safety assessment and crash factors. For instance, in some places you may think, well, we should put a roundabout here, but there are factors that you can go into a DOT handbook and see exactly how that roundabout with that amount of traffic would affect safety for the patrons that live around there. Perhaps there's a tremendous amount of pedestrians, and maybe that's not the best place for a roundabout because they sometimes pose a challenge to pedestrians. Another recommendation is to adopt the level of traffic stress standards for your active transportation network. So this graphic's pretty good. I mean, a traffic stress level of 1 generally means all users feel comfortable using that corridor on biking and walking and just different types of multimodal transportation. But as you get to a 4, it becomes much more difficult, and so those are going to be people that are what I like to call a power walker. They're going to be there no matter what happens, or a bicyclist that is going for distance, and they wouldn't mind being out here on 331 riding a bicycle across the road. Obviously, you wouldn't have moms with kids on training wheels out there. So adopting these standards is definitely a safety mechanism that you may include in your comp plan. Priority corridors. Again, these priority corridors that you see here on the map, they can be prioritized to put together corridor management plans. And what a corridor management plan can do is that is a review of not only the safety, but the ability to be able to move on that corridor, whether you're in a car or on a bicycle or you're walking. And if you prioritize some of these corridors, it really helps you put together a plan and focus on the ones that need it the most. And if you get that safety plan put together, then you can go after different federal grants, such as Safe Streets for All, just to name one. Everyone's interested in new roadway alignments. There's a few shown here on the map, and you have a east-west connector here from Mac Bayou Road to US 331. Another is a north-south connector between 30A and 98. East-west bypass for 30A, and then a north-south connector for 98 and 20. And while you see these lines and areas on these maps, it's important to know that in this stage of planning, we just show a line on paper. But there's so much that has to go into actually getting that corridor constructed, especially if you're going to use federal or state dollars, which I expect you would. And it's an extremely long process. That is the law, that you have to provide, it's called PD&E, Project Development and Environmental, and it looks at socioeconomic factors, environmental factors, obviously, and engineering kind of takes a backseat to those at that stage, just to see where those corridors may go. And usually you see more than one alternative, and there is a no-build alternative with those. So, again, considering these to be able to take traffic off of your existing corridors is definitely a recommendation here. And mobility hubs, again, we talked about those very briefly. They can include park and ride, the micro mobility, the transfer, and the route terminals if you were to be able to put together a transit. And you have a mobility plan, and it was put in and integrated into a mobility fee report and here's the cover of the document here, and this needs to be updated regularly. And again, it comes back to planning in advance of being able to attempt to get grant funding to be able to not only pay for the PD&E and the design, but ultimately construction. September of 2023. Another update, update and expand the countywide policy on traffic calming. So this is near and dear to my heart because I worked in local government for 20 years and I had traffic calming. And traffic calming is always something that is very difficult to implement because you have to look at more than just the street that you're looking at putting traffic calming on, but how that's going to affect adjacent neighborhood roadways. And traffic calming these days is definitely much more than just throwing a speed bump or two on a corridor. You can calm traffic by installing planters. If you have a existing wide road and you want to narrow it down, you can put planters in the median. Looks nice, narrows up the lane, tends to slow people down because people will drive as fast as they feel comfortable. And if you make them uncomfortable, they'll slow down a little bit. And again, it goes back to that context design. You're probably not going to do traffic calming out in the rural areas because you want those people to be able to move quickly. However, in more of a suburban or an urban area, you're going to want to slow those folks down again for the safety and the practicality of the neighborhood. And you see here on the list, traffic circles within neighborhoods, crosswalks, chicanes so that you have to slow down to dodge something in the road essentially. But these are different ways to calm traffic, and it's something that you can definitely put in your comp plan that works its way into the land development code and finally gets put on the ground with new developments. And it appears that's all I have.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm going to turn it over now to Aaron, who's remote.
All right.
Hold on. Yes, they did.
So that's a very good comment. And a year ago, I spoke with a developer who was proposing an apartment building, and he did not have enough parking. And the statement out of his mouth was, well, in 30 years, there won't be as many cars. Which he's right. However, what about now? Because you got to plan now. So he ended up having to put in the required parking spaces for what we have now. And, you know, technology is growing so quickly. There are grants available once you have these safety plans that we talked about, where you basically put together a technology corridor that uses some of the technology that we talked about that is integrated into the traffic signals that can see, okay, traffic is backing up or traffic is not moving as fast as it needs to, and that AI can adjust those signals to be able to focus on that peak direction at that point to be able to move that traffic through there. Only if you have capacity. That's it. Yep. I completely agree with that. However, the way most traffic planners and traffic engineers are looking at it now is because the cost of construction is so out of control. And it takes so long to go through the federal process to be able to get those capacity dollars. For instance, in 2005, I was a young engineer and I started work with Santa Rosa County. And at that point, we were looking at DOT was looking at funding right-of-way for 6-laning Highway 98 from Gulf Breeze to Tiger Point. It's under construction now, just now, 20 years later. So the federal process takes so long. So you have to look at how much bang can I get for my buck in adjusting these signals and putting together a traffic management center where you actually have people and computers looking at cameras that are cropping up all over the place and seeing how we can make adjustments to be able to move that traffic more efficiently, because those additional lanes are so far off. And in some cases, you don't want them anyway. I mean, obviously, you don't want to add lanes to 30A. I don't think anybody wants to do that. And it'd be it'd be pretty tough. So again, and if you were adding lanes, again, it's so much per lane mile to be able to add that asphalt. So do I have a perfect answer for your question? No. But I can tell you that technology is growing so quickly that use of sensors on streetlights in urban areas and even suburban areas to be able to, again, build these technology corridors. They have sensors on these lights to be able to see how the cars are moving and to be able to make those adjustments. It's really come a long way just in the last 5 years. And it's going to continue to grow, again, with the autonomous vehicles. Those scare me a little bit. I ride a motorcycle, they scare me to death. However, if they overall increase the safety, I think you're really going to see them take off. Yes, sir. So, the question was in the late 80s and 90s, we were concerned about synchronized lights, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about everything that goes into what a synchronized light looks like. So, oh goodness, let's go way back. 40 or 50 years ago, if you went into a small town, you would see a sign hanging from the traffic signal that said, "Signal set for 35 miles an hour." Fantastic idea in a very small setting, because the idea is if I get a green light here and I put that speedometer on 35, I can just ease right through town and I'll have that green light the whole way. Sounds great. Until you move out of that small town and you move on a overloaded corridor like 98 through Destin, let's say. It gets really hard because you have so many cars coming in on the side street. At some point, those lights have to turn red. And when they turn red and everybody has to stop on the main line and it's full, and I start letting people come off of the side street onto the main line, they have nowhere to go. So again, you jump into computer programs. Your traffic engineers have a lot of computer programs at their disposal. One of the most widely known is called Synchro, and you input the traffic data in there and it puts together a simulation. All of the engineers that are consultants for DOT, they have so much modeling capability these days to be able to see just how that traffic's going to move off of the traffic counts that you have available. So when you have a lot of traffic, it's really hard to be able to, it's called coordinated timing now. It may not be to where I can set my cruise on 30 miles an hour and drive all the way down a long street. But they are timed such that they have to do a give and take and be able to allow that side street traffic to come in just to be able to keep that main line moving. So there's a lot to it, a lot more than most anyone can imagine anymore. So, all right, someone else's turn.
We'll have opportunities for other questions, but we're going to move now to Aaron to talk through the capital improvements, and you just tell me next, okay?
Okay, yeah, I'll go ahead and tell you next. And yeah, if anyone has questions in the room, once they move the speaker for you guys to hear me okay, I'm having a hard time hearing back, so we'll save questions at the end of when I'm presenting, so we don't have to shift it back and forth. Overall, our recommendations on the capital improvements and infrastructure, there's a big picture of infrastructure supports civilization in turn through your tax dollars, impact fees, all that supports the infrastructure. And so the big idea is to match the intensity of infrastructure investment to how intense the development is. Next slide. So you can put that in a nice little chart where you've got high and low development intensity and high and low investment. If you've got a high cost of infrastructure with a high development intensity, you've got many people spreading that load. They all pay for their property taxes, impact fees, sewer, and water. Their sewer and water bills every month, and that's a much more tenable situation. If you've got low intensity development, low infrastructure investment, people are on their own wells and septic systems, they're on a more rural road, that's also good in the lower right. You've got a lower cost match to lower demand supported by fewer people. Where you get in trouble is when we have either a low development intensity with a high infrastructure cost, because then you've got a high cost with few people supporting it, or you've got a high development intensity with a low infrastructure investment, which overburdens infrastructure. And that overburden, there's a big range of what that means. We were just talking a bunch about traffic. If you have to sit 2 cycles through a traffic light, it's super annoying, but you're going to be okay, like long term. Some more immediate health and safety concerns with potable water, wastewater, and rainwater infrastructure where things are truly not safe. Next slide. And so this is kind of the way to look at that. In the top right, we've got fiscal problems. We've got too much infrastructure for too few people supporting it. In the lower left, we've got physical problems where there's just problems with the infrastructure supporting the civilization. And then on the top left, that would be an okay area. This is like the growth areas that we were talking about earlier in the sector plan. And the lower right, this is more like conservation, or I think, sorry, I used the wrong word, it's preserve.
Yeah.
Areas in our sector plan, and towards the middle would be our maintain. Next slide. So that's an overall framework for all these policies. So in the comp plan, there's a policy that says that hazards should be removed. The recommendation is just to tweak that a little bit to have capital improvements also be considered for the reduction in risk. So on the top in this picture here is an example. We've got a completely separate bike path. That's probably the safest, best way to, as they were saying earlier, have a stress level 1, where kids and training wheels and moms can ride bikes and push strollers. But Walton County doesn't have the funds to do a completely separate bike network across the entire county all at once. So other projects that can improve, where you've got a buffered bike lane, or even just some extra paint, are, I guess, tiers of reduction in hazards. And so your policy should support that sort of approach, appropriate to how the county commissioners want to go about it. Next slide. In the current policy, there's a directive to consider the cost of maintenance, like the lowest maintenance cost infrastructure is literally how the policy is written. The recommendation is to consider the total life cycle cost. So if there's something that is so overbuilt that you don't have to maintain it at all during the entire life cycle, currently your policy recommends capital costs, we'll pay a little more in maintenance, but overall we'll come out ahead, or beyond. And that's a very project-by-project specific determination, but it's something that I think is a little more appropriate to compare apples to apples between your projects. And so that replacement and renewal cost, they should be balanced. So along with that infrastructure cost, the county should make a capacity constraints and opportunities map, basically find the areas that you have existing capacity, existing sewer and water capacity for new development, and that should determine, or not determine, but it should inform your sector plan map. And then those areas that will require more infrastructure investment, if someone wants to develop there, they need to bear that greater cost, because it's going to cost more and it's going to be shouldered by fewer people living in that area in order to get the concurrency. And so, or you determine that area is more appropriate for conservation and preservation based on the existing infrastructure. Next slide. In the current comprehensive plan, there's a section that has a 5-year capital improvement plan. It's basically hard-coded into the comp plan, and it has run its course, and I think it expired, like the last project on there was supposed to be completed in 2020. So this recommendation is just to pull that out of the comp plan and reference the capital improvement plan. I was told by county staff that there is that document, but it's just not reflected in the comp plan. So to pull it out, and then every year you'll have a batch of projects that should be feasibly fundable over the 5-year course, and then every project will move along in this queue to be the next batch, and every year you should have a batch of projects coming off that list as they get built. You could have a 6th year out, or 6+ years out of your total wish list of everything you want to do, but the 5-year plan should be everything that you think can be feasibly done given the constraints of your budget. Next slide. This policy ties into that big picture. We should prioritize capital funds in areas with a greater return on the public's investment. So either that means you're serving most taxpayers or populations that are in growth areas. And it's also secondary to the initial objective prioritization. So in other words, we want to maintain what we have now first, and then any further investment should be places that return the greatest prioritization, or have the greatest return. Now, that's not necessarily to mean that we don't invest in rural areas, because that's not what this says. It is, it's still important to invest in our parks and open space. That's some of the things that drive a ton of tourism for Walton County and serve the local population. But we want to be cognizant of how much return and how much we're driving the flywheel of that economic engine for the county. This policy is related to a situation where the county isn't in charge of most or many of the utilities, whether water and sewer or others. And so having a policy that allows for support mechanisms to allow for a partnership with those private utility companies to expand services, to provide grants, to co-apply for federal grants, allows for greater collaboration on these items. For example, there's large areas of the county that have septic systems, and having it, it's going to have to be an incremental approach where like a low pressure sewer system can be combined with the existing septic tanks to take off the leach field part of it. That would then collect all the effluent from the leach field and bring it to a central treatment location. It's something that the county can partner with the private utilities. That's not to say that that's the thing you have to do with this policy, but that's an example of what would be done with that, and would allow it to provide grants for example, the homeowners to connect to that system. Okay, next slide. And then a couple of recommendations. I think this was mentioned earlier. There's some technical level of service metrics and standards that are in multiple places between just within the comprehensive plan, and it's also in the land development code. Just to make sure that if those ever get updated, they need to be in one spot, and then everything else needs to reference that one spot, so you don't end up with, it says 50 here and it says 45 here. And, or if you update it, you've got to go through every piece of every document to make sure you're not missing one of those places that the level of service concurrency metrics are at. And then there's a sidewalk fund buyout option for developers. That doesn't seem to be working as intended. The intention is to make it so that sidewalk is built all at once, and that a development pays its fair share. It seems like that is not calibrated to the actual cost of construction, so it's better to have chunks of where sidewalk is than chunks of where sidewalk is not. Next, infrastructure. Our recommendation, this is a repeat of the recommendation earlier, but it's to consolidate. This is just an example of where those numerical standards are in both the land development code and the comprehensive plan. Next. Those standards should be updated with the utility providers to ensure that level service standards continue to be updated to the current state of art. It's just to make sure that things are updated and not creating new standards over and over again. Okay, next slide. So most places should already be in compliance with the level service standard. There may be a few that are not. This policy would, it's similar to the improvement of risk reduction versus complete risk elimination. If you improve it and it gets you 80% of the way, that's something you should at least consider. And that would be better than no improvement at all. Now, it's obviously the goal to get everything up to the complete level of service standard, but especially with transportation, with constrained corridors, that sort of approach, this may be an appropriate policy for areas. Yeah. And then this recommendation is also related to, for example, the effluent in septic tanks, or having the University of Florida Extension for advanced septic treatment, or water conservation, for awareness campaigns. There's several organizations that are doing things that the county is wanting to get done, like Habitat for Humanity is working on housing affordability. So this policy recommendation is to include supportive organizations working on the same problems that the county is trying to solve. This is just a smattering of organizations. There's a ton more that I found that are nonprofits. It's not meant to endorse any one of these organizations in particular, but just making it so that the county is able to work with others that are already doing work in the areas the county is trying to get done in. Next slide. The current comprehensive plan states that all systems should be connected to central sewer, and this is a recommendation just to include a feasibility. This is as the system gets built out, or as additional homes are brought online, there's a more feasible areas are feasibly able to be connected, but this is just reflecting the reality that it's not going to be something that can be done overnight. It's going to be something we've got to set a policy goal on and work toward over several administrations, through several elections, through several economic cycles. It's going to take a while. It's something we're going to build towards. And then in that realm, developer reimbursement agreements are a mechanism where if someone wants to build something, we talked about earlier, where they pay more know that there's a growth area just beyond that, and you tell the developer, okay, well, you size the sewer line, 4 inches larger or 2 inches larger, because we know there's gonna be additional demand later, then that has no benefit for the developer, but then the next person developing can reimburse that change in cost. It's something that the county can do to ensure that overall the cost of development goes down, without, increasing the burden on the general taxpayer base. There's references in the comprehensive plan for septic systems. There are advanced treatment types, and so this recommendation is to add references to those advanced treatment types. As appropriate, it's referenced in Florida state statutes in the actual text of the recommendation that's cited chapter and verse. Next slide. And then in the groundwater recharge areas that are impacted by runoff and rainwater coming across like parking lots and development and going into areas that are recharging aquifers, there's some areas that you want to be a little more sensitive to because they're more ecologically sensitive. The recommendation here is for the county to develop a map of those sensitive areas, making sure that everyone is on notice that these areas are the areas that we want to protect the most, and publish this map so people can, when they're doing the due diligence, should I buy parcel A or parcel B? Well, A's got this additional requirement. B is going to be better, and you end up with a better ecological result as well. Next slide. And then this is again related to having your technical standards in an appropriate place. The policy should reference these standards, but the standards should be in their own technical design manual or specific to stormwater. This will allow for a lot more clear presentation of how your stormwater infrastructure needs to be built, how to maintain it, and it will result in more consistent planning quality, more valid local design assumptions, and usage of best management practices. Next slide. And then these additional recommendations are all related to stormwater. Stormwater, right now, the county can do projects that are related to life safety or that are related to an emergency or specific in the capital improvements plan. And so this is just adding a third priority, which is below the other two, if there's a cost-benefit ratio greater than 1. So every project has a cost, every project has some benefit. If it's not related to the other two priorities, but it still has a greater benefit than a cost, the county should at least look at it, be able to look at it. So that's the policy recommendation here. And then
Well,
prioritization, yeah.
sorry, did I cut you off?
A little bit, but let's see. And then on the last recommendation is just right now the policy, the way the policy is written implies that AM can, with the engineer can provide a drainage study, and that should be what the county goes off of. This policy recommendation is just to let the county review and accept a drainage study before it's acted on into the comprehensive plan. That's it.
Thanks, Aaron. And while it sounds very technical and very incremental, you know, and not fun to talk about or not sexy drawings, it's really important to ensure that the level of services and the capital improvements that are provided are fiscally sound, that they make sense where the development goes. This is really about clarifying, clarifying the contradictions that exist, or the making sure that different departments are aligned, that the projects are fiscally sound, and that, you know, they support the development, the level and intensity of development that's going to wherever it ends up being. And I think that's very important. All right, I'm going to turn it over now to Giorgio. And Giorgio, big picture.
Yeah, thank you, Marina. I will start with just want to mention that as a part of this effort, the conservation and coastal management team work closely with planning, infrastructure, capital improvement, and transportation teams, residents and county staff to ensure that policies that we are proposing here for change or new are practical, forward-thinking, and aligned. We also drew from best practices in other coastal communities to help tailor solutions that reflect Walton County's unique context. And as a consultant, our role in this project was to help integrate this feedback into policy recommendations that not only support the comprehensive plan update, but also reflect the community values and long-term resilience goals. An additional note is our focus was to look beyond the individual or site-specific aspects and to establish policies that are providing a clear framework for future growth, environmental stewardship. These policies can be applied judiciously across different contexts and refined with the land development code, which is another critical component. And also, that was our plan, was just to provide the general vision. With respect to coastal management, we have the coastline is one of the most valuable and vulnerable resources, and we are building on the county's long-standing commitment to environmental stewardship, and the updated coastal management policies address today's challenges, which include sea level rise, stronger storms, and continued development pressure. The new and updated policy for the coastal management enhance the protection of poor dune systems, improve flood resilience, and ensure responsible coast development. They also strengthen the requirements for stormwater, native vegetation, and public beach access. And to provide additional details, I will list the topics we have, you will find in our report. Strengthening the protection of the coastal dune is one of the important aspects. Enhancing the citizen engagement in lake management, we consider that as another important aspect. And the next slide. Managing the native vegetation and also removing invasive species is very important for the nature of the area. Wastewater management is an aspect which reduces the potential pollution, and that also has to be addressed. For example, the central sewer connection is required for all new development, and prohibition of new septic systems in sensitive coastal area. Details of all of these we will find in the report. Next slide. The native vegetation restoration in the coastal zone is another important aspect that has to be addressed. Strengthening the coastal land use regulation is also a significant contribution to coastal line deterioration. Integration of stormwater BMPs and green infrastructure is a particularly important aspect. Next slide. We also address sustainable marina development and requirements for various environmental impact assessments and BMPs, dry storage and spill containment were emphasized. Public beach access enhancement is one of the critical access based on the feedback from the residents and the visitors. Next slide. The beaches and dunes protection policies have been strengthened in this version of the complaint. We provided additional information and recommendations. Floodplain management in FEMA and VV zones is an important aspect for mitigating potential scenarios of hurricanes and other extreme events. In terms of, next slide, in terms of emergency shelters and pet-friendly planning, this is another aspect for which we provided expanded policy, and also which strengthens this aspect. Post-disaster redevelopment policies were updated to reflect the current state of other coastal areas, for example. And this is with respect to the coastal management. And then we can go to the next slide where we discuss the conservation. So for the conservation, I also wanted to mention that this has always been a part of Walton County in identity. The updated conservation policies continue this legacy by strengthening protection for wetlands, floodplains, and natural habitats. These changes are needed to respond to the growing development and climate pressures while keeping the county's history of land and water stewardship. The updates that we provided include recommendations for stricter mitigation standards, expanded green infrastructure, incentive-based strategies that promote long-term preservation. And for example, strengthening the wetlands and the clustering policies, requiring stormwater buffer, BMPs, buffer considerations are some of the aspects. Also, we address the need for science-based environmental protection, since that's another aspect which can contribute to improvement of the overall conservation efforts. And the next slide, we also address the stormwater management policy to ensure that that resilience is integrated into design, and also to address potential rainfall intensity increases, storm surges, hurricane impact, and others. The multimodal transportation policy was added in this aspect to encourage bike pedestrian infrastructure as a recommendation to and also for transit supportive design. And the next slide. We also address the mining oversight and regulation, and the need for additional strengthening of the regulations for active and abandoned mines. We introduced also the green building leadership by government, and we modified some of the policies while also introduced new policies to address this. The next slide. We also address the alternative energy development, which should address how this policy would encourage renewable energy, and also to add the environmental criteria for this. We added a new policy for tree protection ordinance. This was a very strong component in the feedback from the residents. And the next slide. Which is the last slide, we introduced a new policy for incentive-based conservation strategies, and Marina briefly mentioned earlier about this, to offer different incentives based on different alternatives in order to encourage permanent protection without limiting the land owner rights. And I think this is my last slide.
Thank you, Giorgio. I think before I turn it over to Philip to talk about the fiscal productivity, I'm going to stop sharing so he can share his slides. I just want to say, I think a lot of this is very technical, but if we had to encapsulate what this is trying to do, there are essentially three things. One is to provide you with a more predictable framework under which development can happen, and to ensure that the services are there to provide it. Two is to clarify some sections of the comprehensive plan that were either required clarifying removing sections that probably belong more in the land development code, and just simplifying where possible, removing programs, for example, that aren't being, achieving what they want to achieve, and just revisiting that, because we tend to want to, bloat comprehensive plans and throw everything at it, but you really want to take on what you know you can manage. 3 is definitely to provide a greater, a more, not only a more predictable, but a criteria under which rezonings can happen within a framework that is understandable and predictable. And obviously, the last one is to, as you saw in the presentations that were given here, a real sense of an acknowledgement of how the better management of growth can happen from a transportation, from an infrastructure, from a coastal management standpoint, from a conservation standpoint, so that those areas that need to be protected are protected, and those areas where that can develop, we want to ensure that the growth, that growth can be sustained. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Philip to share his screen.
Thank you, Marina. Am I coming through?
Oh, you have to share your screen first.
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Is it now?
Yeah, hold on.
Yeah, I'm seeing it, but
Okay.
I'm not the most important.
Okay, and it's there in the room?
Yes, we can see you and hear you.
Okay, perfect. So then what I get to do is tie it all back together with a discussion of how land use and infrastructure can really be simplified down into our universal language of money. My name is Philip Walters, I'm with Urban 3, and that's what we do, and we like to try to use a little metaphor to help us with that. For starters, I want to offer you the option to look at your community the same way a farmer would look at their land. They may have a lot of different fields, so they're going to use per acre terms to compare them to each other. They're going to be aware of what kind of effort has to go into the ground, what kind of seed costs, fertilizer costs, time on the tractor, and what kind of yield they expect to get. They're gonna know all of this as a farmer going into making these decisions, and I think that's a good and useful way for you to think about your community too. Usually that starts right here at just the parcels countywide. And a couple of things stand out right away. As a county, you have a lot of parcels that aren't supposed to produce crops for you. Those are maybe an Air Force base or a wildlife area, right, a wetland. But a lot of your parcels are different kinds of fields. If you're looking for some of the warmest things on the legends, those are up by the ocean. There are some large and valuable items. But I love to direct everyone's attention up county too. There are some very large farms that are worth millions of dollars. Maybe they're not even farms, just forests, but they're big, right? So we have to do value per acre to make meaningful comparisons about these land use choices that are turning into our civic budget. There are a couple leaders to help you find things as we're looking at the map. Now let's look at it in value per acre terms. And you can see that the heat has all shifted around. Per acre, some of your most productive crops are in both the middle of the county and down by the water. You can see this a little better now, I think, if I just turn it up in 3D for you and add a couple of labels again to help you orient. You don't get to make a new oceanfront, right? There's some amazing stuff going on there, and that's where all those tourists are going too, right? But this is essentially your existing crops and their productivity for you as a community, getting things like roads and infrastructure paid for. This is maybe a little abstract. Let's look at it more like the way you experience day-to-day life. Across the top, those are residential uses at varying intensities, and then commercial uses, and at the bottom, mixture of uses, which really only happens once you get a certain degree of intensity. But you're seeing, along with those, these price tags, these yield productivity from these different development patterns. Let's try that same information one more way. Now it's in a bar chart to give you kind of a sense of just the jump up that you get, or maybe adding another story or two. You wouldn't want to do that everywhere, right? But when you do it, this is the kind of financial productivity that you get back. Or we can really put all these ideas together, and we're going to use those images to really label things that you might know out here on the map with the kind of productivity they have for you, the kind of crop yield they have. And then some of those real outliers, just in case you wanted to know what that high point is. Now, that's all just set up, right? Because we're talking about your future. What do you want to be next? What development directions do you want to make easier or harder? Where do you want to go as a community? identifying the ideas in the plan and translating them backwards in terms of, well, that's probably a lot like what you're doing to arrive at the kinds of fiscal impacts for you, the kind of productivity for your community, and that's paying for things like police officers, sheriffs, school teachers, right? That each of these development patterns can have. We'll just walk through them a little bit. In the settlement typology, and I forgot to point out for you there, sorry, the little dotted gray line is something you already have. Values are a little older, right? So it's not going to keep up with new development. But Hammock Bay, kind of for reference there in the dotted gray line. As you do different settlement types, you see different financial productivities occurring for you. And there will probably be some range in between. But those are the expectations we have if you pick any of these particular ways to build your settlements. In corridors, we had to adjust up, right? Now we're going up into many more millions, and I want to point out that at the urban level, there can be a lot of range, and that goes back to something like if you choose a lot of civic uses, that's okay, but you're just not going to get as much payback. And I'm not here to tell you what you have to choose. I'm just here to give you this extra piece of information so that as you make those choices, you get a sense of the financial feedback for you. Now, the last piece that's really interesting here is the center. They'll start to, you can have a rural center. I think Marina mentioned this, right? Like a kernel, I think she called it. That's a great way to think about it, and it can still be a really productive thing, but as you continue to stack up, you can get more and more productive through transit-oriented centers or maybe urban centers. And then, again, there's a little bit of a transition in between all of those, or we can just look at all of them at once. As you do any of these patterns of development, at any of these intensities, this will, I think, be a handy rubric for you going forward as you contemplate a policy decision or a specific actual development. What kind of feedback should you expect from that financially? And now you've got one more, hopefully, useful piece of information as you're making your land use decisions. I promise to be quick, Marina. That's all I wanted to share for now, but I'm very open to any questions that might come up.
Thank you, Philip. I think, so thank you for bearing with us because this was quite a technical presentation. And I just want to end by saying that what Philip showed right here is actually quite important because when we looked at the amount of land in Walton County, once you take out the conservation land, the state forest, the agricultural land, the industrial parcels, Eglin Air Force Base, you're left with 22% of land where development can happen. And of course, of that 22%, the vast majority is already developed. So what this is trying to show us is we want you to be very judicious and be aware of the consequences of the decisions that are made about the types of developments you want to see. We're not here to say everything has to be high intensity because that's not the case at all. If you take anything away, it's really to understand that you have three very distinct characters: rural, suburban, and urban. And what we're providing you with is that framework under which you can decide where does it make sense to be a little more urban in order to preserve those areas that need to be preserved, and where does it make sense to, where are we okay with, continuing a little bit more of suburban development, and then where do we draw the line at the rural and agricultural areas and not allow development to intrude into those areas. So we are happy to take questions that you may have and go back to any of the slides. And we're here to answer any question you may have. So I'm going to ask Travis, maybe can you pass around the microphone so that the consultants can hear the questions that are asked? And then I'll ask each consultant to respond to the question as needed. Is that on?
Now it's on. And you get a car, and you get, no, just sorry, that was my Oprah. He had his hand up first. I'm going to come back to you, Doug.
Okay. So, Marina, my question to you is, you were talking about the 22% just then. If we're looking at South Walton, where is that number as far as undeveloped? Because this is the area that people are desiring. If you're looking at doubling the growth, I mean, that's going to be the most important area of figuring out how to use that land the best. And I think we talked about that before on my properties as well, is how do we figure out the best land use in that aspect? Because I think from what I've been able to gather, you're talking about 3% that's undeveloped in South Walton or somewhere in that that number. And so I think it's very important to understand what we're trying to do with those remaining properties moving forward. So can you address that as well, since there's a lot of pushback in that area?
Well, you know, it's a complicated answer because you may have 3% undeveloped land in the South Walton, for example, but there's tremendous development capacity that hasn't been maximized. And land values are, so a lot of people have, for example, one-story buildings where the zoning allows them to go 4 and 5, right? Why haven't they done it? Because the market hasn't been there for it, the transit's not there, the demand isn't there. So even if there's only 3%, it doesn't mean that South Walton will not densify over time in ways that are more appropriate as developers or property owners begin to take advantage of it's very, because it's very rare to see development happen even today when they have this much capacity and they're only building to this much capacity. We understand why that's the case, because you may encourage residential over retail, but frankly, your zoning doesn't permit it because the density is so low that nobody wants to do it because it's not financially feasible. You do want to have multifamily over retail in some areas, especially where you're going to have urban corridors, especially where transit's going to come in. So that's hard to predict in terms of where that development is going to happen. I think what's more feasible is to imagine the area that isn't developed. Like, for example, there are huge projects coming in on the south and east side of Freeport. What should that, but not within the incorporated areas, but within the county areas, what should that development look like? How can we make it as sustainable as possible, right? So it's going to be a combination of all three. It's going to be where the sector map, when you look at the sector map, and Mike's reminding me to tell you that the sector map is not, you're going to see, we're going to put it on this, Travis is going to put it online tonight or tomorrow, the big A0 map that you could print out very large and really zoom into it. But the idea is not to look at it parcel by parcel, because it really needs to be adjusted with the commissioners of your district, with all of you looking at the map to say, well, this makes sense in the growth sector. No, this makes sense to retain in the preservation. Of course, it still has to align with the underlying zoning. So what we've tried to do is very grossly say, okay, if it was zoned commercial, it's going into the growth. If it's south of Walton and it's pretty much developed, we're putting it in the maintain. We've established that criteria to sort of guide that discussion so that it's not sort of free-for-all where development, you know, that there's a rationality to how that sector map gets adopted. So it's a bit of a convoluted answer to your question. It's very hard to say. We can't say where development's going to go because it depends on who wants to develop first and foremost. What we hope comes out of this is a desire to develop in a way that is more, that really meets the very ambitious policies you already have in your comprehensive plan, which is to develop in a more sensitive manner and in a way that is really befitting of the beauty of this county and the development that you know you have and probably want to see more of, and those that you actually don't want to see more of.
Marina, one of the other issues that came up at the previous workshop, to your point, was that on our sector map, there are some instances where, for instance, the city of Freeport has already annexed additional land since we developed the map. They've expanded their sewer lines, so there's some just things that have changed over time in the past even few months. So we'll just want to make sure that everybody takes that map with kind of a grain of salt.
Correct. And so what Erin was showing earlier is where the infrastructure is not there. So for example, areas that are on septic in which where the sewer lines haven't reached yet, those areas are not going to be designated growth areas in the immediate future. They're going to stay preservation, which doesn't mean nothing happens, but it means very little happens. Or they're going to be in the maintained sector. You have to align your future infrastructure investments with the sector map, so that where you designate growth is where there should be priority to extend lines where they don't currently exist right now, and where there's a desire to see development.
Marina, my name is Barbara Morano, and I've been working diligently with the code and comp plan and standing at a podium with rezoning and many projects. When the county first started on this plan, those commissioners were looking at code changes, and I think they're going to be a little shocked that this is as wide and vast as you just presented to us. Quite frankly, we need cliff notes. And if you stand in front of the commissioners, you know, this is going to go over everyone's head, and it frankly went over mine tonight, and I think I'm pretty in touch with things. You had about 10 items here when you initially started out, and I was a little bit more hopeful at that point. It said that we're not necessarily getting the quality of development that we deserve, and that's absolutely correct. But we've got to see a little bit more of a 1, 2, 3 kind of thing, and I know you were a little reluctant to give your opinion about where we should go, but you were pretty clear here when you came out with 10. You said, for example, there are too many overlapping categories with minimal differences between them that do not, results. And I think, again, you've got a clear, you've got wonderful statements here, but you've got to pull it to where we're really failing.
Okay, so can I just address that one point?
Sure.
It is in our report. I wasn't going to sit here and tell you, you really need to consolidate, I'm just going to throw out, because I can't remember off the top of my head, Village 1 and Coastal Town Center and Village, whatever, you have very funky names. We have really looked at that, and we absolutely recommend, very specifically, which zoning categories and which flu categories can be consolidated, and which ones, by the way, you can do away with. because
Where
you
is
have-
that? That wasn't
It's in the
tonight.
report. It's absolutely in the report.
It was
And I
tonight?
can,
It's on the website.
it's on the website. You'll see it. Because
And-
we're not just throwing out vagaries. I wasn't going to get into and I appreciate what you've said, and we'll think and I agree. When I heard the presentation today, I thought, there's no way we can present all this to the commission. It's just too much. We're going to have to break it down for them into real big picture and then get very specific about the answers that they need. So when I say we are recommending consolidation of zoning categories, that is absolutely in the report. You'll see it. When I say we're recommending the abandonment of some flu categories, because there's only 2 parcels that are zoned that, where that is also in the report. What we haven't done, and then I'll take your other question,
Yes,
is
sir.
made zoning recommendations, because frankly, your entire zoning code needs to be revamped to a certain degree. We have made certain recommendations, like if you want to see retail over multifamily, you have to allow it. And establishing 17 units an acre won't do it. So those are the so we are getting a little specific in that.
Right,
respect. No,
spot
okay.
zoning and rezoning. And I also want to mention Seaside and Rosemary Beach, they're resorts, all right? And, people can live with that density for a week because they're there on vacation. But the reality of, is that truly a development that you're going to raise your children in and do, I question that. So I don't like using those two
Okay.
as examples.
Well, let me tell you, I live in a TND, which is it's a development.
Is
that
it a
happens to
resort?
have-
Is it a resort area?
No.
No, that's what I'm
TND does
saying.
not have to be a resort. Now, the reason there's a resort here is because it is a beach, it's a beach
Right.
community. But just so that you know, the community I live in happened to be designed by DPZ. It is a primary home community. It has over 5,000 homes. It has over 1 million square feet of retail. It's got AstraZeneca right outside. And it is where I have raised my child, where he's raised his kids. So you can have a TND as a primary homes as much as you can have it for a resort. It's not, one is not mutually exclusive.
But we don't, my point is, we don't have that yet.
Well, yeah, you don't have it yet,
No.
but you need it. And specifically north of the bay, there are opportunities to do that.
Right, and I think we're all looking forward to that, but again, when we use Seaside and Rosemary as examples of that, they are not, they are resorts. So,
Yeah.
you're,
Well,
Okay.
because those are the only TNDs you have in Walton County. I can show you example after example after example of TNDs from in Florida and maybe just Georgia and South Carolina, just so that we stay within this area, that are the type of communities you really want to encourage here, because a lot of you have moved here permanently. Some people were coming here for a few months of the year, but now it's become permanent homes for folks. And so there's tremendous benefits to living in a TND community. And it's not for everyone, as I said, but for those who do want to live in a walkable environment.
and let me just mention 2 problems, and we have some people from the Planning Commission here. Our infrastructure cannot take some of the developments that are coming through. So there is now a movement to say, safety is an issue, we're not going to approve that development. Well, what's happening is there are lawsuits coming at us because we're saying we're denying things from safety. That's one thing we're facing. The second thing we're facing, and I'll just throw it out, is a small neighborhood zoning. Right now, we're fighting that. What is a small neighborhood zoning? Is it a restaurant that takes 200-plus seats, or is it a restaurant that takes 50 seats? That's not defined. There's a lot of gray areas in our code, and I certainly hope that we can get to that sooner than later. But again, this is monumental change, and code is really what I believe the commissioners were looking for, and I believe what we're looking for. So thank you.
So I just want to ask Mark a question, because you said there's level of services that aren't, that the development should be denied because the level of services aren't there. As I understand Florida statute, even if the level of service isn't there, but the zoning permits it, you're allowed to do it as long as you're bringing as long as that level of service is going to come to the site. That's how someone's explained it to me. Is that not correct? You can't deny a project. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So Barbara, just to say, this project is not a zoning rewrite. The zoning rewrite is completely, the comprehensive EAR, we would love nothing more than to rewrite your zoning, but that's not what this is about. This is about, but here's the thing. Zoning rewrite is very helpful once you have a clear, comprehensive plan and a vision. The reason it took us, so we spent 8 years rewriting Orange County zoning, Orange County, Florida's code, and updating that comprehensive plan. Why did it take 8 years? Not because it took us 8 years. We began to rewrite their code because they wanted a form-based code. Then they said, stop. We have to update our comprehensive plan. That took years. Once the comprehensive plan was established, it was much easier to come on the tail end of it and adjust the code to support that. So we would say to you, first, tell us if you want, if the commission's going to have to tell us if they want to see this kind of, these recommendations adopted for place types, for sectors. If that is the case, then your zoning absolutely needs to be adjusted for it. It's not to say we haven't made zoning recommendations already. We have made recommendations, as I mentioned, lower the price of the size of housing from 50 feet to 40 in those neighborhoods that have preservation plans. There are recommendations we know we can make right away. Adopt a tree ordinance, as Georgia was saying. That's also a land development code. There are recommendations now, but your zoning really does need to be looked at comprehensively. Yes.
I have a really
Oh.
quick one this is really for Stephen. Stephen, does the Planning Commission have any role in any of this? Just curious.
I mean, the simple answer is yes, you are the recommending body to the Board of County Commissioners. So once we get a more finalized draft, it's going to take some additional workshopping and potentially even individual meetings with the commissioners or maybe in their districts. We kind of need to map that out, how it's proceeding, but it will come before you to recommend adoption or changes as you all see fit prior to going to the BCC.
Yes, sir, and then here.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I'm Dave Hewins, retired Air Force mathematician, not a lawyer, not a developer, not even really rich. So if I take a 30,000-foot view and see everything as an algebraic system, you'll have to kick me a little bit. I have a quick question, then I'll make some comments. One of your slides, the three recommendations that you had, summaries of recommendations for land use. Short-term rentals for more than 6 months should be commercial. Did you mean for less than 6 months?
No, so for example, if someone builds a massive home and wants to rent it out for more than 6 months a year, because they're putting it on the Airbnb or short-term rentals. No, just more than 180 days a year.
Okay, that clarifies it. I think 2 years ago I was at a meeting where they said short-term rental, STR, equals by ordinance definition anything under 180 days. And then I think it was late last year they said anything under 30 days. And I would like to just put in a word for the idea, the concept that anyone who rents for a term under 6 months should be considered commercial.
Well, so Mark, I'm going to ask Mark to address this because as I understand it, the state
Yeah.
defined
The state's taking our rights away at the local level.
They have decided that you cannot regulate short-term rentals very much at all. So what the county did is try to put in regulations that will make it harder by requiring so much more parking, by making sure that you're meeting sort of, the requirements of smoke detectors and exit signs and all those things that technically make it harder.
Yeah.
It's
yeah.
difficult because you don't want to see 11 parking spaces on a lot, right? It's too much asphalt, it doesn't make sense. It really makes much more sense, we think, to discourage it. If you start to tax people, not as a residential property, but actually as a commercial property, which is what it is.
Sure.
We think that's legal. We think it needs to be vetted, but it's something that should be explored.
It's probably going to have to go through the courts to make a final definition, just
Maybe.
from my experience with this part of Florida. Okay, well, let me give you a bit of praise now. For those summaries, you mentioned that you want to simplify the zoning, and I've been really interested in less zoning complexity, more zoning stability. I think as profit-driven as most developers are, and I'm not knocking that, I think it's a good thing, but in order to cement their expectations, solidify them up front, simpler zoning is always going to be better. Fewer categories, more clarity about how long those categories last, how easy or difficult it is to change them, that kind of thing.
And, I can tell you, 20 years ago, the information about that didn't exist. But now you have multiple municipalities around the country that have adopted versions of form-based codes, which is all about simplifying, clarifying, while providing a more predictable predictable outcome of what the zoning can yield.
Mm-hmm.
Because, for example, 20 units an acre, well, what is that? Is that townhouses? Is that many single families together? Is it a cottage court? Is it a small multifamily building? Doesn't tell you anything about form. So now there are a lot of cities that have adopted form-based codes that are where we can actually see the results. The development process is simpler. It's easier to permit. Projects are getting permitted faster. We saw one, I was recently at the Congress for the New Urbanism, where there's a city, South Bend, Indiana, which is giving people permits within 20 minutes. If they meet the code, they're getting their permit. And what the developers tell us is, if you give us that level of predictability, and the community is not going to come out and scream over every development because they understand what it's going to look like, that's how you're going to get affordable housing. That's how you're going to get more investment in your public realm. And that's how you're going to get just better buildings. It may not be better architecture because you just need better architects, but at least you'll get the urbanism correct.
And one last item, the height limit, I think you mentioned you're in favor of moving it down from 50 feet to 40 feet. I thought it was 55, which I think is high. I would hate to see it get higher than 55. I think 40 is a great idea.
It's controversial because some people aren't going to like that idea. Those who want to have short-term rentals are going to fight it, probably.
Sure.
But for those of you who live in neighborhoods and live in a house that's 2 stories and have the potential of having a 4.5-story building next to them, that's just not right. Maybe on a corridor it's correct, if you're right up against an urban corridor, for example, but certainly not we think not in the middle of a block. That's a fight that's going to be very contentious, we think, and it'll be for the commission and you all to come out and support it or not. Yeah. Can you come here so that the consultants can hear you?
The most robust regulation for whether that survives So I would say Walton County, Clay, and the commission passed probably the most robust regulation of short-term rentals that I've seen compared to other counties and cities after the state preempted. Whether that stands up judicially, we'll see. I'm sure there's challenges and are going to be challenges, but to their credit, they have the plan and the regulations they have in place are fairly robust compared to other counties.
I mean, look at the Live Local Act in Florida. You're seeing the state they're seeing municipalities not react to the massive challenges of affordability. So what do? They adopted this Live Local Act, which is a very blunt instrument, right? It's essentially allowing, if you provide 40% affordable housing on a property that's either zoned commercial, mixed use, or industrial, you can go as tall as the highest height in the community, as high as the highest density in the community, or as high the height is within a mile. So here it's not so bad because you have 5 stories, but imagine in Miami if you have an industrial property that's capped at 2 stories and they're a mile from downtown that can go to 80. You can imagine what that's doing. But what that tells us is that there are serious problems that municipalities, there's paralysis by analysis, right? They're just not acting, and so the state is reacting and saying, we're going to take this out of your hands. Michigan just passed a law, I read this last week, that in the larger, because they also have an affordable housing crisis, they have decided that any new development within the big cities, like new subdivisions, not infill, cannot have lot sizes greater than 3,000 square feet. No more 5,000 square foot lots. That sounds insane. Like I would think, wow, in America that can happen. Well, those are the kinds of decisions states are making to address the real challenges that we're facing. And I can tell you, as a planner that works all around the country, everywhere we go, we hear about massive affordability challenges, massive road problems and lack of walkability. And so what I take away from all of this is that if, as a municipality, if you guys are more proactive, you'll be able to control it better and not have the state sort of dictate what should happen.
Thanks. John Genazo, I read your entire plan, took notes on it. I have the Cliff Notes here. Somebody wants them. I got a lot of things here. I'll just try to mention them, and I'll put them in writing and back to you, and other people can comment as needed. The maps absolutely got to have it's 2025. Maps need to be interactive and easy to use, easy to access. So you guys are already working that. That's a must have. The tourist factor we already mentioned. You got to, our population swells by 30, 40,000 people, and it's not accounted for, I don't think. We don't think. Most people don't think. Somehow we have to account for that. The rural corridors are disappearing. You're maybe looking at a rural corridor today. Highway 20 might be a rural corridor. In no way, shape, or form is it a rural corridor. It's a 2-lane, 70 mile an hour, 60 mile an hour highway, but it's not going to be rural for another blink. Okay, there are thousands of units already planned and plotted for that road. That has to be taken into account, and the commissioners need to know that.
That's the whole idea of a sector plan, and the place types is to acknowledge what's already happening and how you can plan for it in the future, so that there's some level of consistency.
That would be helpful. I suspect that the level of sophistication resident in our processes today are lacking. 1996 first plan, updates sometimes, county administrators come and go. Somewhere you have to address what resources the staff is going to need. We got a lot of hard-working, smart people, but they need the resources and the time or something to put all these, or some of these, or whatever that this commission decides into action. I mean, we can't have an overworked staff that doesn't have time now to, do some of the updates, doesn't have the leadership of a county administrator, but somehow you need to identify the resources, types of people, places they can, pull from, because I'm sure that they would probably appreciate the help. I mean, we're a fast-growing county. We're not 20 years ago. We need to pony up and make sure our guys and our gals have the right resources to get it done smartly. The sidewalk buyout scheme, thanks for mentioning that. It's a Ponzi scheme. I don't know what it is. It's some kind of scheme. The compliance, enforcement, and long-term planning is a big factor of what you brought up here. That has to be brought forward to the commissioners as well. Everybody who's ever had a complaint goes, okay, somebody chopped down trees, they paid a $2,000 fine, big deal. That we have all the things that people are really aggravated about or up in arms about or come to the meetings for. What's plotted, what's planned isn't what happens. And that's why people are so active. We don't want to put this in place because we know the problem. We've been here, we've lived here, we've seen it. You say you're going to do this, it's not going to happen, it's not going to happen, it's not going to happen, and then you have problems. Much better to avoid the problems than to walk into them. If you can highlight those compliance requirements or somehow, stress it.
Sorry, just to address that point, I think we have done that, and we're always telling cities in which we work or municipalities, don't adopt a rule that you're not willing to enforce. Otherwise, it's just pretty words on a paper.
Exactly.
So we're all for being. That's why we told the county too. We've looked at your policies, and if there's and a lot is super ambitious, right? But if you can't meet it for whatever reason, or it's no longer useful, have the discipline to take it out.
That would be helpful. And then people don't say, hey, I expect you to do this, but they're not going to do it. And I think you need to bring the sheriff's department into it as well, because when push comes to shove, they're the ones that, are you really gonna do this? And the sheriff has to say, I don't have the resources, you know, to do the zoning or whatever. The fatalities on Highway 20, I'd like you to look at. I don't think they're accurate. I don't think they match the number of roadside memorials that line Highway 20.
Someone gave us those numbers, I think someone from DeFunia.
If I could see the map better, maybe I could
Yeah.
count them, but I count the roadside memorials along 20 between the Mid-Bay Bridge and Freeport, and there's about 12 or 13 of them, so. And, well, yeah, 331.
We've heard that too.
I haven't counted the memorials there. The priorities, I think the commissioner's going to have to wrestle with the bike lanes and low-speed vehicle passing lanes and things like that versus what the other resources we have available. In your discussions, does Walton County Board of County Commissioners have a prioritization policy for their budget plan? I mean, are there categories, do they say, okay, our number one category is public safety, our number two category is infrastructure, our number three category is, you know, health and welfare or quality of life? Did you see anywhere in your resource investigation that they have a very clear set of priorities, so as they build the budget, they know where they're putting the buckets into?
So I can tell you from a planning perspective, no. From a transportation standpoint, there are priorities in terms of the next 5 years and the next 10 years, what's in the pipeline. You know, the road extensions, new parks, they do have priorities already established. Now, what we're hoping can happen with this idea of a sector map is to really help prioritize providing the infrastructure investments initially, for example, where the growth sectors are identified, right?
Two more things. The developer reimbursable agreement sounds an awful lot like impact fees, and those have never been successful down here for whatever reason.
I don't know, because it's successful everywhere else.
They've never been successful here, believe me. I've been in the middle of it several times. And the one area you didn't really address, I'd like to see a little more when you talk to the commissioners about industrial, because industrial zoning, we have a lot of industrial zoning that nobody looked at for 20 years, and all of a sudden, ooh, how did this 3,000 units of houses pop up? Where did this 300-unit apartment pop up? Where did this 1,700 home platted development pop up next to this industrial, the mining, the things like that? We have a lot of that in the county, the industrial, because that's a real hot button issue for a lot of folks. So,
I don't remember seeing a lot of industrial zoning in your county, but if you are getting multifamily within it,
we have
the
industrial
problem.
butting up against.
yeah.
We have heavy industrial within 3,000 feet of 4,000 houses, and nobody would plan that. Nobody. So I'll put all this in notes, and I'll give it to my District 1 commissioner, and hopefully they'll pass it along.
Thank you. We appreciate you reading the whole thing. I'm sure very few people have.
Anybody else before I come back to you? Anybody else have a question?
I guess my impression here is you've put an awful lot of work into the comprehensive plan, but I don't think the best comprehensive plan in the world is going to solve the problems of leadership and finances available to implement it. And what really bothers me is, you said you had some tools that could help, and tools that would predict when you reach capacity of some infrastructure element would be great if they would do anything to halt building and development until either the infrastructure catches up or you build excess infrastructure so that you can grow into it. But you can't have management growth if you just willy-nilly allow all the development to go on that is asked for. And that seems to be one of the biggest problems in the county. First of all, I don't know which road planning or transportation planning you've talked about, but I know there was a transportation or a road and bridges infrastructure planning group that came up over a 5-year period of $500 million worth of roads and bridge infrastructure that was necessary. And I don't think this county they don't budget $20 million a year. So there's no way you'd ever come up and get ahead of your infrastructure lag or the excess, what's the right word, the saturation of the capacity that you have in your infrastructure. So until you have a commitment from leadership to actually lead and to make difficult decisions and to enforce or make the developer and managed development abide by your comprehensive plan, it's really not going to do much for the county. I don't think. I
hear you.
hate to say that because I think you've put a lot of effort into this and there's great ideas in there, but I don't think without commitment on the leadership of the county and the willingness to spend and finance what's needed, you're ever going to get anywhere.
So, that's a difficult, it's probably not a question, it's rhetorical, right? But the commitment on behalf of the commissioners, that has to come from them, right? They agreed that this was a necessary project. Well, it's also probably mandated by law to update your comprehensive plan every so often. But we hope this will make their life easier because they're in a very difficult position of sitting behind the dais and essentially hearing everybody, the 99% of the people who are here are complaining about what's happening, right? So I would think that they would want to see solutions proposed. And what we have all shown you today, I think, is additional tools that can help create a greater level of predictability. That's our hope. Now, you vote commissioners in and you vote them out based on whether they're doing their job or not. We can start at the national level. Like I think, I'm not going to say, but everybody should be compromise. I think compromise is something that's absolutely necessary. We've forgotten about it at the national level. It's like a dirty word to use now. It's necessary at the level of community building. It's messy, it's complicated, it's incremental, it's difficult, but it can be very rewarding. But it does require a tremendous amount of collaboration, and it does require compromising. So I know they know that. I would hope they know that. They seem supportive. We have already presented the idea of place types to them, and they did tell us, go ahead. This sounds intriguing. It sounds like something we would want to see. Now, they haven't seen the level of detail that we've presented to you today. We're going to have to think about how we present that to them. It may have to be broken down into sections, I'm not sure. But it is a lot of information. But we have to hope that this is going to make, the whole idea is to make it easier for them to review projects, not harder, and to make decisions about where the investments go, where the infrastructure goes, how it catches up, and all of that. And maybe we're too optimistic, but we've seen this happen in many other places too.
So discussing the compromise side of it,
Yes.
looking at.
Sorry, hold on. Someone wants to make a comment. Keep the microphone. Yes. Aaron?
Yeah, and I hear that, with the infrastructure, like you're trying to catch up with this backlog of maintenance that has been happening, right? Especially with your road infrastructure. And so it's a really hard line to walk, right? You have too much infrastructure people, you have that fiscal cliff, and then you don't have too little infrastructure, you got that physical cliff, right? Of things that don't. So in order to get your way out of it, I mean, that ties into what Urban 3 was showing with your fiscal productivity of your land. You got to make sure that if you're going to put in infrastructure, if you're asking for improvement, you've got to make sure there's enough people shouldering that burden alongside with you, that it makes sense. And that's a really hard policy decision because that's balancing 5 different ways, right? Does that help answer the question, or?
It helps clarify it a little. Yes, sir. All right, Aaron, June 10th, watch the commission meeting that happened, and then come back and see if this works.
Okay, June 10th.
That just happened,
year,
yeah.
Just 7 days ago?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yes, sir.
Marina, looking at compromising and everybody compromising in this room and looking at the future of growth and things like that, and I appreciate everything that everybody comes and brings to the table. But it seems like, as a county, we keep pushing back against every project and we find a way to figure out how we don't want any development. But what's happened in that aspect, if you look at the middle part in the big growth sector of Freeport, and you talk about the safety issues on 20 and all these different things, if we keep pushing back against development, what's happening over there is the fact that they're becoming annexed by Freeport because developers don't want to deal with going through the county and dealing with meetings for the BCC. And so because of it, this county is losing a tremendous amount of money and opportunity for growth. And I think that we as a group and as a county need to come in and compromise and figure out how we can all work together to create better development like you're trying to put forward. And I know you see it throughout the nation and you see these annexations. And I think it's really starting to hit us hard right now. And how can we get everybody, the same people that come to the meetings that are looking out for the environmental side and things like that, how can we all get together? And what are some of the ways that things can improve, that where everybody can work together, that we're not losing these key marketplaces like Freeport because we're not willing to compromise. We want to defeat every single thing that comes up. So what have you seen and how can we do better?
So, it's a losing proposition to fight every project because eventually they move forward in one form or another, and it may be through annexation, for example. So I'm not saying this is a panacea, what we've given you, but it is a system under which you as a community have to decide, we will accept growth here, we'll accept less growth here, and we don't want to see any growth here. And then you want to make sure that the growth, when it does come, is in a form that is acceptable to you. The reason, we understand why people fight projects, because you think, okay, 1,000 homes coming here, right? Well, 1,000 homes at 10 car trips a day average is 10,000 cars on a road. Every day. People fight projects because of density, because of the traffic it brings, and because of the perception of density. So if we can, and it's understandable. That's why it's so important. And I know it sounds very lofty, but to create environments where people can walk and don't have to get into their car, even if 2 or 3 of the 10 car trips a day can be taken through by walking, it's helping get you there. And whoever mentioned the fact that we have clients who are convinced that these, self-driving cars are here 10 years from now. And the potential of that is going to be tremendous because they're going to drop you off, they're going to go off to park in areas that are less expensive, which enables you to develop more judiciously where the development occurs. It's going to enable a lot of people who have garages on their lots to maybe convert them to something else, whether it's a workspace, whether it's an ADU, whatever the case may be. That's coming. We know it's coming, and it's coming much faster than we thought, So there are going to be tremendous opportunities where land exists and where development already exists to densify in a more acceptable manner. But you all have to decide where you want to see that growth occur. We've heard north of the bay, right? On 38, it's pretty much developed already. But we did hear about a project that came in as of right on the west side of 38, and the community came out and fought it, and then D.R. Horton bought it and built, they wanted a rezoning, and D.R. Horton bought it and just did a horrible development. So the fact that you come out and fight projects that are approved by right tells you that your system is broken and you need to fix it. So hopefully these tools will help move you in that direction. Yes.
Hi. I would like to speak to, and I'm so glad you mentioned that we have a terrible zoning problem in existence. In specific, a project in District 3, which was Commissioner Glidewell's district, where you had what was originally permitted as a recycling center and presented to the public to be a very positive thing back in 2016. That project was never completed. There was supposed to be a 35,000 square foot facility, never built. No one ever circled back around. When you talk about, when my associate over here talked about things being permitted and not happening and no follow-up, zero. And then years later, it's a bait and switch over the holidays. The project all of a sudden gets the Florida DEP to permit them, and they're approved to be a Class 1 facility, where a 60-day moratorium was imposed because Commissioner Glidewell said it and we believe it. That particular project sits right on top of our Florida aquifer. It has the potential to damage the potable drinking water for all of Walton County. And as fast as Walton County and Freeport have become on the map, one of the best places to live in the country, we could have as rapid a decline as we've had growth over this single issue. And most of the public isn't even fully aware of this. There's been no updates to what's gone on since that 60-day moratorium. And quite frankly, there are other projects like the gentleman mentioned that are industrial on top of residential, on top of Highway 20, where there's no roads, no turn lanes. And these things were zoned that way years and years ago. No zoning was ever re-looked at. Nothing was ever upgraded. I'm certain there have been comprehensive plans all up until now, so something tells me that we've had one plan after another with no follow-through. So we have several critical projects right now that are critical to our water supply, our beautiful bay, our drinking water, and these are public safety issues. And so we don't have till 2040 to wait to rezone these areas. And I would put it before everybody here, because this affects every business and every resident. Just because a property is zoned something does not mean that that property can be used for any project someone wants to rubber stamp and put on it. And the county commissioners have an absolute responsibility to protect the public first in these instances. And I would think that the public could request a moratorium on those types of projects that are in the works right now, and they're being tried. Like you said, they tend to move forward anyways, one way or the other. But this is a huge matter of public safety, and it's a huge matter for sustainable growth and building the type of community that we all love and that we want for future generations. And I really hope that you'll give us some help and support on those particular projects and those issues. Thank you.
Thank you. That's quite jarring to hear. I don't know enough about it, but we'll look into it. We'll ask Giorgio to look into it.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, but our consultants may not.
Oh.
That's why you need to use the microphone.
Just a comment on the gentleman said the population. I thought he said it increases in the summer by 40,000. And Scott Jernigan may be able to comment to this, or Barbara Morano may know the facts, but I think we go from 80,000 to 280,000 plus. So, you know, and if it rains, it feels like 1,280,000, right? We all, you know, see that. But I'm curious, and this may be a Stephen question, it may be a question you, Marina, but, you know, for the longest time, when the governor said Graham said in '85, we were going to have a comprehensive land use plan. That was the mandate. Well, what happened for us, I think we were the second to the last to adopt a comprehensive land use plan. So we had no impact fees, which turned into proportionate fair share, I think is what we went to, which was neither proportionate or fair. The developers paid for everything, though. And then now we're in a mobility fee structure. So everybody's going to pay. If you owned a land piece of property for the last 30 years and haven't built on it, now you build on it. You are creating the impacts. I think that's more fair because you're creating impacts, building there, and you get to help pay for future infrastructure. But with this mobility fee structure, is somebody tracking what that means to us from a revenue standpoint? What are we going to have, Stephen? Are we going to have the money to turning lanes and expansions and so on?
So the mobility fee wasn't designed, at least that's my understanding, to be, to use your term, a panacea to our transportation woes, right? It's designed as a match for state and federal grants, essentially, to show that we've got some skin in the game to make these improvements. We are certainly tracking all the mobility fees that we have collected thus far. We've got 7 different accounts, different planning areas that those fees go into. I think we're in the neighborhood of 1.2 million thus far, somewhere around there.
But would it be fair to say if we are not
having development, if we're not handing out building permits, we don't have any money for future infrastructure, do we?
I mean, that's accurate, with the, you know, the voting down of our, 1% or 1 cent tax, 2 years ago or so. We are limited in many ways, and reliant upon what development brings to the table in many respects.
Yeah. Well,
You know,
David,
just a couple of things.
I'm sorry? That's right.
The couple of things. One, you do get a lot, you know, the tourism that brings headaches also brings a lot of dollars here, right? I have heard, and I don't know how this would work, but that Governor DeSantis is thinking of doing away with property taxes and just using tourism taxes, which I don't see how that works. But that's something that's being explored, which seems rather radical, and you are a county that's very reliant on tourism. If you wanted to discourage tourism, which we wouldn't recommend, but if you did, you know, Daytona Beach or one of the beaches along the East Coast got tired of all the spring breakers, and so they've imposed some very rigorous and rules to discourage the spring breakers from coming. You know, they've got massive curfews. There's certain times you can't be in the streets. So hopefully you don't get to that stage, right? But if you wanted to do it, there are examples of the way you can look at that, but you have to understand the implications of that.
Marie, I would just say on the infrastructure side, and David said, can we not work together? The people, a lot of people get here on Tuesday. They don't want anybody else here on Wednesday. That's a age-old problem for our community. Yeah. And so, you know, but the people have got some skin in the game, been here a while, see the complexities, the problems, come to the meetings. You know, they've got, could we not work together? Well, here's one of the things that not working together has caused us. People don't want to go through the brain damage of ridicule at the podium or being accused of being a greedy, hard-driving, arrogant developer. And so they won't go through the process of, example, something that would be, they want to limit what they're going to limit what they're developing to 20 lots on a 10-acre tract. And what that does is they don't have the money to make it nice, right? And they don't have enough residents to maintain it in a proper manner. And so, but they don't want to get up there and get beat up, so they just get the path of least resistance is to just do something small that it doesn't, you know, doesn't produce something that might be a mixed use and all. So please, let's start working together on it. And at the same time, we're going to have some development to have any future infrastructure. I don't know how many times people have got to hear that, but we got no development, we got no future transportation. So.
We're not saying, you know, mixed use has to go everywhere.
And
please don't take that away, but take that from us. But we think it should be in many places, many more than you're allowing right now. Let's put it that way.
And at South, the beautiful complex next door, Herbie, freshman, is catching on the varsity team tonight. So I'm out of here. Thank you.
Enjoy. Oh, behind.
So I'm kind of like Barbara, but in a different capacity. I've been here for years for a whole bunch of meetings. And I think what you said, Marina, earlier is absolutely right, that if you've got the community coming out fighting projects, there's a problem with the code. A lot of people in the development community want to make it into a problem with the community, okay? But I'm telling you, I've seen the agendas, I've sat through the meetings. There are so many projects that go right through and get approved. The community never gets involved, doesn't want to, because they work. And I'm not saying the community's always right about every single thing, and I'm not saying the developer's always right about every single thing, but there's definitely a pattern. If we had a problem with the community and the community was a bunch of NIMBYs, then you wouldn't have development getting approved and approved and approved and developed. I mean, there's buildings going up everywhere of all kinds. A density projects, high-density projects for here. They're not high-density for some areas, but for here. Apartment complexes, all kinds of stuff that never gets the attention or fight from the community. So I think, you know, he left, but when Mr. King says work together, I think there's a lot of room for that because you don't see the community coming out and fighting every single development or every single development with density even.
So why are those projects being, the ones you just mentioned right now, what are those projects that are being approved with no objection?
Well, they do a lot of things right, for one, and they're not trying to take advantage of loopholes in the code, for another. A lot of time when there's room in the code and a developer is trying to make use of that to their benefit, but there's fear that it might be detrimental to the community, that's when you see a lot of people stand up and start fighting a project. And so that's what I'm getting back to my original comment and thanking you for saying that. I do think there are problems with the code. When there's room for interpretation, when there's vagueness in the code and or the zoning system, then you're going to have that stuff because it's not cut and dried. And that I'm not saying that's in every case, but a lot of times I see that is that's the underlying issue that creates all the fight, is when there's ambiguity in the code and gray area and difficulty interpreting certain things. So I think this exercise is really helpful, and I hope it ends up getting rid of a lot of that because that'll create predictability for the developers and property owners and the community. And that's what I think is really critical, and that has to carry through to the land development code as a next step.
Yeah, I think what you said is actually very important, and I want to make a couple of distinctions. So, you know, the fact that some projects are approved and others are not. Often when we go into cities or municipalities to rewrite codes, we recommend, so there's always a level of interpretation that has to happen because zoning is not like an engineering document. There is some wiggle room, right? But how much wiggle room is important? So we tend to tell communities, think of necessary deviation from the code as major and minor, right? So the minor should be administratively approved that are minor deviations. Like, for example, if somebody wants to cannot provide 21 parking spaces, but it's 20 within a certain percentage, that should be allowed. Or if they want to adjust their setback because there's a predominant setback around there, those are the things that should be easy to approve without torturing either the property owners or the developers over it. Then there are the major ones. And the major deviations are the ones that do go to the public because you're getting requests to rezone properties that have no rhyme or reason, right? What we did in Miami, for example, is we created something called successional zoning, which is if you want to rezone your property, you don't get to decide what you want to rezone it to. You rezone it to the next level up. So if you're zoned for whatever, 5 stories, you go to 6 stories, or if there's a rational reason under which the successional zoning can happen. And by the way, we're only going to review this twice a year. So you want to make rezonings difficult, and then you want to have, there's always going to be needs for variances. What is the criteria for those variants? And that's also important, so that it has to meet the goals of your zoning code, and it has to meet the goals of your comprehensive plan. And by definition, a variance is an imposed hardship. And wanting to make more money or wanting to have more units is not a hardship. So if you had that clarity of, here's the criteria for rezoning, here's what we think is a major deviation that does require we go to the public process, and here's the minor that can be approved administratively, and you may have versions of that already, but clarifying that may help you a lot.
Marina, I'm reminded of our session in May last year when we had our charrette, and in one of the packed house meetings there were a couple of gentlemen who were property developers who basically said the exact same thing. If you tell us what we can do, we don't like coming up here and getting beat up. Tell us what we can do, and we'll do the best we can to achieve that, but that also gives neighbors and residents the predictability of knowing what's going to come into my neighborhood or into my community. So, but if you don't have that clarity, you get what you get.
I have a question that is probably a tangent off of this, but you're talking about density and housing, but one thing that's not been addressed, and I don't see, is too much industry in this community for jobs, because there's a low level of opportunity. So we're a service industry because we service the tourism, so you have workers who are building the construction, and then you have the people who work in hospitality and restaurateurs. So there's not really other opportunities for people to stay here that go to school here or take technology classes, or there's not that many hospitals, healthcare facilities, and this is an aging population area. So I was just curious if that aspect of thought was put into this master planning for the overview of this community to be a vital organization,
Yeah,
vital entity.
That's a good question. So we're not master planning, but we have heard very clearly that there is a desire to broaden the uses that come here, and your Department of Economic Development is looking at that, and is looking at first how your workers can live here, not have to go, to Alabama now to afford to live, and there's talk about bringing some people who want to bring a new hospital here, some people who want to bring higher education here. That's another benefit of adopting a code that's more form-based than use-based, because if you allow things to be mixed use generally, those uses can come in insofar as the form of the building can take it. So if you think about low-scale buildings, medium-scale buildings, high-scale buildings, and what are the uses that are appropriate there. As a cautionary note, I would tell you there's an article that was written recently about Charleston, because they have lost, there's a lot of tourism in the historic area. The shops and the restaurants that are mom and pop shops are literally closing down because they can't afford, the workers can't afford to work there, the restaurateurs can't afford to keep the businesses open. And so you're seeing this complete, you're seeing shops shutter and all of that, and you don't want that to happen here. So you really want to be encouraging, you have to have a code that encourages small scale retail, medium scale retail, large scale retail, small housing, medium housing, large housing. Little industry, and most industrial uses can happen in the commercial areas, not the heavy industrial. But the light manufacturing that you're seeing now is perfectly compatible with, downtown buildings, as long as it's, it's containing the noise and the vibrations and the smells and all of that within its community. So that is being thought of.
So I think we got to cut it off because we're going to close out, but I think if you want to catch us on the way out, we can have some follow-up conversations. Does that work, Marina?
Yes, thank you
All right.
to all of you who are online.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Yeah.
You guys